Well, why don't we get going? Good morning, everyone. So my name is Joel Tickner. I'm a professor of public health and at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and director of the UMass Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, Sustainable Chemistry Catalyst, and also executive director of the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, a broad multi-sectoral full value chain network focused on accelerating the growth of green and sustainable chemistry. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Amy Cannon, the first PhD in green chemistry and the executive director and founder of Beyond Benign, an organization which I've worked with for many, many years. So welcome to today's webinar, which is the outcome of a year-long effort to define sustainable chemistry in a way that advances a broad, actionable definition and criteria. So next slide, please. So this is our agenda for the hour. We'll do some overview, and then we're going to talk about the outcomes of the project, and then have a panel of some of the members of our expert committee on sustainable chemistry, and then a time for discussion where we want to engage all of you in understanding how can we leverage this definition and criteria to drive action in investment, in education, in industry, in government. Next slide, please. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of the project. Sustainable chemistry has been broadly defined by many organizations to date, including its connections to other fields such as green chemistry. The lack of a clear, broadly accepted definition and set of criteria for sustainable chemistry can create confusion. It can limit policy, market, investment, and education actions that advance the field, and ultimately the goal of driving innovation to deliver chemicals and chemical products that are safer and more sustainable from production through end of life and recycling. Research has found that confusing definitions and lack of consistent criteria for sustainable and safer can be important barriers to the growth of sustainable chemistry solutions, deterring research, investment, critical capital investment, and scale. The lack of clarity can also lead to greenwashing, where chemistries or products that are labeled as sustainable with little rigor or analysis against a clear definition and criteria. It can also lead to potential for unintended trade-offs, where a sustainable chemistry solution may enable greater benefits in one area, for example, energy efficiency or improved circularity, yet have increased toxicity that can adversely affect human health and ecosystems. This lack of clarity can also hinder training and research opportunities for future chemists who need valuable skills and applied practice to shape future design. Next slide, please. The goal here of our project was really to develop a consensus actionable set definition and criteria. With its incorporation into the European Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, the concept of safe and sustainable by design, and the US Sustainable Chemistry R&D Act, as well as increasing demands for sustainable chemistry from investors in the marketplace, we felt that there was a pressing need to develop a clear, actionable, and concise definition and actionable criteria for sustainable chemistry. As such, the Lowell Center and Beyond Benign leveraged our expertise and broad and trusted networks across academia, industry, nonprofits, and government communities to bring together and articulate a robust definition and criteria for sustainable chemistry to catalyze and focus government policy, market action, and chemistry education. Following several months of early stage discussions, we created the Expert Committee on Sustainable Chemistry, or EcoSCHEM, in 2022 with the charge of establishing an ambitious, actionable definition criteria for sustainable chemistry that can be adapted to different audiences and contexts and enable effective government policy, business, and investor decisions, support chemistry education that accelerates innovation and spurs adoption across all supply chains of chemicals that are safer and more sustainable. We aim to establish a broad group of experts representing diverse constituencies that could effectively work together to find common ground and direction, as well as engage their own constituencies in dialogue, which would create a networking effect. The EcoSCHEM dialogue was supported by extensive research and engagement with external stakeholders to ensure that our work was actionable and informed by key government and non-governmental efforts on the topic to date. Ultimately, the definition and criteria we arrived at, which we'll describe in a little bit, outline both a desired state and a path for what sustainable chemical products should aim to achieve, and against which to measure project progress, recognizing that few, if any, chemistries or chemical products today will meet the definition criteria. Ultimately, achieving sustainable chemistry is a journey. It's a journey of continuous improvement that starts with a bold vision for the future, acknowledges and addresses past harm, and provides beneficial products and services for humanity with as few negative impacts as possible. We know that this will require significant increases in research funding and investment for alternative chemical feedstocks, chemical and process design, renewable energy production, education, and innovative business models to achieve the definition. We also understand that a complex set of actors, including governments, industry, across sectors in the value chain, investors, academics across disciplines, educators, civil society, and the public all play critical and important roles in supporting and implementing sustainable chemistry. So our committee really did do a ton of work over the last year. We had, as I said, 20 experts from the US industry, or US, EU, and Africa, representing academia, industry, nonprofit, and investment community that met on numerous occasions, 16 subgroup meetings, 5 full committee meetings, one-on-one discussions, literature review, and interviews. And our goal here was to achieve consensus with the idea that can you live with the preamble and the definition and criteria and speak of it positively? We understood there were differences of opinion across stakeholder groups or constituencies, that we needed to find common ground. And that was our goal, is to find common ground that drove an actionable approach. And that was the exciting part of this project that we'll talk about later on. We held 2 external feedback sessions. We asked our members of EcoSchem to dig deep into their networks to get feedback. We had a feedback process via a survey and email, and then we did several one-on-one presentations and interviews as well. So with that, let me pass to Amy Cannon to talk about the perspective from Beyond Benign in bringing this into the education community. Amy, welcome, and thanks for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joel. And that was very well said. So thank you so much for your leadership in this, and the Lowell Center as well for your leadership. I'm really happy for our organization to be involved. Beyond Benign got involved with this project really to better understand how to communicate the central role that green chemistry plays in achieving a sustainable chemical enterprise, and ultimately how sometimes these seemingly competing approaches complement each other, or at times they're also different. So green chemistry, in our perspective from our organization, is a central tool that chemists use to address sustainability through the practice of our trade. And we use the foundational 12 principles of green chemistry as those guidelines. And these principles are meant to work together as a collective to provide a more holistic understanding of how we approach molecular design, and challenge us to consider our best approaches in our practice. So even though we use these principles as a foundation of our work in green chemistry, we recognize that there's a diverse and rich history of approaches that others have taken to really all move towards the same direction, towards creating more sustainable, greener, safer chemical products for our global society. We also recognize that it's not just chemists that need to be involved in order to realize this vision. It's also policymakers, business, investors, activists. So therefore, it's really important for us to communicate the work that we do as chemists and as chemistry educators, and work together with those that are both central and peripheral to the field of chemistry in order to advocate for and ultimately implement these greener practices. So I think this is the purpose of this sort of exercise, where we've come together around the sustainable chemistry definition and why we got involved. Whether or not your personal or organizational approach comes from green chemistry or environmental chemistry, sustainable chemistry, regardless of what we call it and whatever resources we use to get there, I believe that we're all working towards one goal and have one end in mind. That of having a society where the molecular building blocks of the products that we use every day are safe and healthy for humans and the environment, regardless of industry sector, and with equity and justice embedded in how we create and use those chemicals. So we're really happy. I'm super happy to be involved with this work. And I really value the diverse approaches needed to achieve this ambitious vision. So it truly will take a global community to achieve what is presented today in the definition and criteria for sustainable chemistry. So thanks so much for joining us for this movement and being part of the movement, actually. So I'm handing it back over to you, Joel.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank our EcosChem members who dedicated an enormous amount of time to this process. Engagement. It's just it was an amazing group of people who came together who really did want to drive better chemistry and find common ground. So we'll be hearing from some of them in just a little bit. So with that, let me transition to Dr. Monica Roy, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production and who really led this project throughout its life. So thank you, Monica. And Monica is going to be describing the end product. So thanks.
Thanks, Joel and Amy. And thanks for everybody for being here. It's great to see so many people that are interested. So what Joel mentioned before and what I'll start with is just a really brief review of the process. And this involved in the beginning a landscape review of efforts that have happened over the last few decades that are related to visions, principles, definitions, or criteria that have been developed related to sustainable chemistry and other terms such as green and sustainable chemistry, safe and sustainable by design, and others. And overall, for this part of the work, 44 sources were identified, with 10 of these sources being identified as particularly relevant for this project. And one of the initial questions that we asked of the expert committee was whether there was one of these 10 definitions that stood out that should be elevated. And it was determined that overall, there really wasn't one definition that encompassed all of the elements that the committee was envisioning. And so then part of this process was conducting a thematic analysis of these definitions, pulling out the most repeated themes that should be included going forward in the development of a definition. And so this analysis, combined with the collective experience of the group, helped to refine a new definition with the goal that it not contradict previous work, but instead find common uniting ground, helping to clarify the position of sustainable chemistry in relation to other concepts. And so at this stage in the project, last June, we didn't yet have a working definition, but this thematic review was submitted to the Office of Science and Technology Policy as part of their RFI asking for input as part of their process to develop a definition. And so fast forwarding through many committee meetings to the final draft, which is what we're all here for today, the definition that came out of this process reads, sustainable chemistry is the development and application of chemicals, chemical processes, and products that benefit current and future generations without harmful impacts to humans or ecosystems. So this definition was created to be both forward-looking as well as actionable. And many conversations occurred in the expert committee meetings as to how to balance wording that clearly conveys what sustainable chemistry should be while also being practical. This definition was also intended to be succinct so that one would hopefully be able to recite it from memory. Part of this process of developing the definition and criteria was circular, and that the idea for the definition was to be able to have it stand alone and represent the criteria, but it also couldn't fully be developed first without thinking about the criteria, which provide clarification as to what sustainable chemistry means in practice. So after having created a working draft of the definition, the committee developed the criteria and then went back to finalize the definition to give you a sense for some of this process. The landscape review, in combination with EcosChem members' knowledge, also provided a foundation for which the 5 criteria categories you see here were developed to support the definition. These categories are equity and justice, transparency, climate and ecosystem impacts, health and safety impacts, and circularity. On the left, or on the right here, each criteria category is articulated further, which are slightly abbreviated in this graphic. You'll see that the language intended for these criteria was meant to be broad enough to capture key aspects that would need to be fulfilled, while not being so specific as to be metrics or indicators, which would need to be developed at a later stage. And to give you a brief overview for each of these criteria categories, The equity and justice category focuses on the engagement and protection of marginalized communities and the prioritization of products that either remediate past harms or strengthens local economies. The transparency category is about information disclosure, verification of sustainability claims, and having chain of custody information. The climate and ecosystem impacts category focuses on the resources and energy used to make and transport products with the intention for minimizing their impact on climate and ecosystems. The health and safety impacts category emphasizes that the materials used to make products, as well as their breakdown products and byproducts, should be non-hazardous and not bioaccumulate. And the circularity category here at the bottom focuses on the efficient design of chemicals, materials, processes, products, and services to reduce waste and impact on the environment. So these criteria, along with the definition, underwent a lot of editing for wording and clarity, especially as a result of the external engagement meetings that we held towards the end of the project, of which some of you here on the call were at and provided feedback at, or provided feedback at a later stage over email, which we really appreciated, and thank you for that. So in the full document, you'll see these criteria written out more fully and accompanied by footnotes that expand upon the meaning of certain words or phrases, and is also accompanied by a preamble in the beginning that provides some further context for this work. Overall, the idea is that a chemical, material, process, product, or service would need to meet all of these criteria categories in order to be called sustainable chemistry, and in order to avoid trade-offs or solutions that only address part of the problem. So despite coming to the definition and criteria, there remain a lot of challenges. The main one being, well, what do these criteria mean in practice? The scope of this project was to create language that everyone could generally agree upon, with the idea that the criteria would need to be further clarified and indicators or metrics developed for different sectors and subfields in order to measure fulfillment of the criteria or progress towards them. The second point is related in that some of the criteria may be more straightforward to put into practice than others. For instance, there's been a lot of work around developing and measuring life cycle impacts, but it was really important, especially in this project, to acknowledge the environmental and social justice impacts related to chemistry practices, and to put that into the criteria as the equity and justice criteria category. However, of course, this particular category is more challenging and requires more work. For example, in developing out what engagement with communities looks like, or what strengthening local economies would look like under this framework, while being practical and actionable. But this criteria category overall was deemed as a critical aspect of sustainable chemistry that must be worked on and integrated. And this last point, again, is pointing out the challenge of putting this criteria into practice, acknowledging that not all products are made the same, and that, for instance, some companies may play just a small role in the value chain of a product. So for these cases, and we heard this in the external engagement meetings, the question is whether all of these criteria categories would apply. Further work needs to be done to really develop the system for what the criteria will look like in practice, which might look like a tiered system to allow for progress, such as something like the LEED certification system for buildings. But this would have to be done in such a way as to avoid trade-offs. We've also heard feedback that writing up case studies to illustrate what these criteria would look like in practice would be beneficial as a future step for this work. So I already mentioned that the landscape review conducted earlier towards the beginning of the project was submitted to the Office of Science and Technology Policy in June as part of this project. And the final document that is now publicly available and that we shared in the chat, and we can do that again, was also submitted to OSTP in December 2022 in order to inform their efforts in developing a definition. So in addition to OSTP's work, the hope is that this definition can in general just be used and applied in a variety of contexts, from in different kinds of industries to investors and academic settings and beyond. And so with that, I will pass this on back to Joel. Thank you.
if you want to go to the next slide here, oh, well, I guess this is the one, and then we'll switch to the panel. So as we thought about the project, I realized my camera's on. As we thought about the project, we wanted to think about how this connects to many other efforts. And I see on the call, many of the folks connected to these other efforts are here. There is an effort by the International Sustainable Chemistry Collaborative Center working on defining aspects of sustainable chemistry. They've been doing this in the context of the global efforts around sustainable chemistry, particularly this strategic approach to international chemicals management. As Monica noted, importantly, one of the first steps of the Sustainable Chemistry Research and Development Act is to define sustainable chemistry. What we hoped with this project is we could give that committee, that interagency committee, working on the definition and a landscape and a blueprint for sustainable chemistry, a definition that represents a broad set of constituencies and needs in defining sustainable chemistry. Similarly, we are connecting with the European Union's work around defining safe and sustainable by design, but also the European Union's effort around a transition pathway for the chemical industry. So this definition can help shape the direction of that transition pathway, because the definition focuses not only on the product itself, but that whole life cycle of the product from where the chemistry originates to where it ends up at end of life. And lastly, we wanted to connect to efforts like the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals, and we'll put a link into that. Louisville Charter was pulled together by an organization that had two members on the EcoChem panel called Coming Clean. And the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals is now a 20-year-old document, really documenting where chemistry needs to go to be sustainable and address impacts, particularly to marginalized communities. It's a hopeful document that lays out a vision for the future. Thank you, Maya, for putting the link in the chat. With that, I'm going to transition now to our colleague, Sally Edwards, Senior Research Associate from the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, who aptly and amazingly facilitated this incredible dialogue. I would expect nothing less from Sally, who is an amazing facilitator and researcher. So Sally, thank you for leading us through this process.
Thank you, Joel. Good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and I really felt like it was a responsibility, but also a real privilege to facilitate this dialogue over the last year. It was really a thought-provoking process and challenging. It required deep listening and respect for different points of view. And as a group, we carved out the time and space for the discussion and really work to create something that we hope will be memorable and useful, both in the policy, investment, and education contexts that have been referenced. So for this part of the webinar, we've asked 4 of our EcoChem members to share some reflections, and then there's also a couple of our committee members on the call that I'm going to offer the opportunity to comment as well. So as you see here, we have Ryan Bouldin, who's Associate Professor of Sustainable Chemistry at Bentley University in the US, Cecilia Wandiga, who's Executive Director at the Center for Science and Technology Innovations in Kenya, Saskia van Bergen, Safer Chemist Lead in the Washington State Department of Ecology, and Martin Wolf, Director of Sustainability and Authenticity at 7th Generation in the US. And we're going to start with Cecilia. And the first question I have for you all is really more about the process. And I'm curious why you joined the group when you were invited, and what stood out as most important to you in the process of developing the definition and criteria. And Cecilia, if you can put on your video and make sure you're not muted.
Now in terms of sound?
Yeah, great.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you. I want to echo Joel's comments on Sally's wonderful leadership as we went through this. It was very long, and she was very patient in reconciling all points. coming from, so both on the US perspective, I've lived in the US for a long time and now living in Kenya. And there was almost like a dichotomous situation where there's a lot of people who know green chemistry, and then there's a lot of people who know social justice. And it was very hard to find a way to bring those two together. Like it was always one or the other or an afterthought. As when we talked about sustainable chemistry, just sort of also knowing the work ISC3 has been doing, and we're working with them, it became evident that somehow, like Joel said, this is not a perfect definition, but it is an invitation to keep working towards. And for us, it was very useful to go through this process of just experiencing what coalition building is, because it's not an easy task to do. So thank you.
And Ryan, how about you? Why did you join the group, and what stood out as most important to you in this process?
Yeah, so I mean, outside of the high regard I hold for the Lowell Center and beyond Benign, I joined because of the multi-stakeholder aspects of it, right? We were in a group of siloed chemists and chemical engineers sitting in a room. I've done that before, that's fine. I'm interested in more having an impact, and we've got to take a stakeholder approach to do that. And so I think the work product reflects that, right? We see the different aspects, we see the criteria, and it really expands and challenges people to think beyond the lab or the product design lab. So
Great, thank you. And Saskia, how about you?
I joined actually just to support the goal of clarity. I think, clarity obviously is essential to advance sustainable chemistry. And I really appreciated the iterative process. As Cecilia mentioned, we had different perspectives participating, and also really the open conversations and the safe space to actually really, think of ideas, hear what other people perspectives were, and then, able to kind of integrate and have the back and forth to improve the definition, because time was definitely needed to improve the document. The final document you see here, it took a lot of back and forth to really flesh out different perspectives.
And Martin, how about you? Why did you join, and what stood out for you about this process?
So as a chemist, I am always marveling at how much impact chemistry has. In some ways, the study of materials and their transformation has done more to extend the life and well-being of humans than any other development, whether it's the development of soaps and detergents to aid personal hygiene, or the disinfection of drinking water, which has made life in human dwellings and cities possible, or whether it's modern pharmaceuticals, or the revealing of the structure of life itself, the analysis of DNA and the biochemistry that drives all of us and sustains all of us. Chemistry is amazing, but the widespread destruction to the environment that feeding our chemical industry has caused, and the harms that we see to particularly developing countries and low wealth communities, makes clear that the way we're practicing chemistry is not sustainable. And we need to change what we are doing. So when I was invited to join this group, I saw an opportunity to define a better path, one that not only looks at the circularity of materials, but also looks at the true health and well-being of both our environment and the people that that environment sustains. And in terms of the process, as has been said, we had an amazing facilitator in Sally, and people who are open to listening to each other and putting forth their ideas without fear of being unduly criticized or silenced. So it was an excellent process with the highest of ambitions and goals.
Thanks, Martin. So moving on to the content and how this is going to be of value to you. I want to ask each of you, how do you anticipate using this in your work? And let me start with you again, Cecilia.
So we've actually started circulating the definition. We got feedback in the construction industry. They already have processes for hazardous chemical management on site during construction. So an health and safety officer said that graphic could be linked to their hazardous chemical management processes. And if we could help them now develop metrics for, are they doing the right thing? Because there's already, there's ISO rules, there's all of this, but there's not necessarily easy metrics. The other, we're targeting lead, mercury, cadmium, chromium, sort of the ones that come out just because they're not only in building materials, they are in electronics, and we have a lot of unregulated dumping of waste, mobile electronics and things like that, or recycling in informal settlements where they're opening these gadgets with zero protective gear, and trying to create an awareness that not only does it affect you as a human being, everybody in Kenya is sort of worried about increasing cancer rates, and creating the link between the exposure on these chemicals, and it does get into your food and it bioaccumulates into your food. So that's a little more difficult of a connection to make, but the graphic really helps do that. So we're really happy with it.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear you immediately take it to these, serious problems and how they can be used for kind of giving people the big picture of how to think about solving them. That's really helpful. Ryan, how about you?
Sure. So I think this project is a really wonderful example for why we need transdisciplinary teams to work together to solve these challenges. So at Bentley, we're a business school, and so we pride ourselves on fusing business with arts and sciences. And so giving this to a student and saying, use this as a foundation to design the next product, right? Chemical product, and then you have to correspondingly design the business model for which this is going to work within, right? And so that forces students to wrestle with all of this complexity that a typical chemist or an engineer would never have to deal with. So it's like perfect for me. It's gravy for me. So I'm really excited to use it. I mean, the one thing that I think that we don't do enough of here, and this will help, is really push the argument about stakeholders over shareholders for our business students. And I think that's really wonderful. So.
Well, Ryan, I really want to come to those final presentations. I want to see what your students create. That's exciting to think of them using this framework. Saskia.
I find I've been using it initially because I think this is I need to think more about how to actually use it. And luckily we'll have a lot of time to work on this, but really using it for context setting. So I've been sharing it with other programs. It helps really show the connections of different programs that are working. In our case, I work in an environmental agency, right? So the unit I'm in is hazardous waste and toxics reduction, but it actually allows one to be much more interdisciplinary within one's program, working with other levels of government, working with, industry and all the other roles that, we mentioned in the document that, we all need to collaborate together to advance sustainable chemistry. And then another place, actually kind of to a younger version of what Ryan mentioned, I started sharing it with K-12, especially in some of the less siloed disciplines, to really encourage really more holistic thinking, thinking about trade-offs in the younger audiences to really kind of help them learn early that this is a lot of the things that you need to consider as you go through education and through your career.
Thank you. And Martin.
So Seventh Generation has as a statement of inspiration and the source of its name, the great law of the Iroquois Nation, which states that in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. And in this work, to define sustainable chemistry, we come up with the idea that to be sustainable, chemistry must benefit current and future generations without harmful impacts on humans or ecosystems. And the nesting of those two ideas, their relationship is remarkably clear. This definition is important because it recognizes that harmful impacts are not only related to health and safety, but they're related to the well-being of humankind and to the environment that sustains humankind. It recognizes that to be truly sustainable, chemistry has to consider the social impacts and the economic impacts and the overall well-being of all people that are affected, not just by the products that companies like Seventh Generation made, but by manufacturing processes and the chemical enterprise from education through to, I won't even call it end of life, but end of use of chemicals. Sustainable chemistry, as we must start to think about it, is not just defined by the circularity of the materials that we use, but with regeneration of Earth's environment and with just and equitable engagement of communities, workers, and by promoting their health and well-being and that of the environment that supports them. So as I work to design products or work with our R&D team to develop products, I hold in mind the fact that it's not just the product that must be considered sustainable, but the entire system that supports that product, from its manufacturing and the people who manufacture it to the user, to, as I said, the next use of those materials and the well-being of everyone along the value chain that touches it. So that's highly aspirational, but this definition gives us the incentive to strive for that great aspiration.
Well, thank you to the 4 of you. I think it's really inspiring to think about. I feel like I've heard about how to use it and think about it in policy, how to think about it in education, how to think about it in a business context, how to think about it on the ground in terms of health and safety. So I think that's really good beginning for how this product of our thinking could be used. And we have a couple of other committee members who are on the call, and I just wanted to offer them the opportunity to comment either on, why they joined in the process and how they imagine using them. So start with Maya and I from Coming Clean, and this is optional to those of you I'm calling on, but Maya, I didn't know if you'd like to make any comments to the group.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sally. And I just want to echo all of the praise for your facilitation in this process, because there was quite a wide variety of knowledge being brought to the table here. And so, yeah, why I'll just say why I became involved. So Coming Clean, a nonprofit organization, as Joel mentioned earlier, and we are working to make sure that the chemical industry is no longer a source of harm. Essentially, that's where we come from. But one of the reasons why I really joined this committee is because this is not just an academic exercise. It has real life implications for my community on the ground in Chemical Valley, West Virginia, right? This is, I wanted to make sure that the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals was embedded in this process, because that's a framework, it provides guardrails around thinking about policies and thinking about these sorts of things that that was built and constructed that was built and constructed by people on the ground in environmental justice communities like mine. And so ensuring that equity and justice were central to this has been key to me. And, safer chemicals is absolutely essential for dealing with the health effects that I see in my community in Chemical Valley, West Virginia. It's essential for dealing with the legacy pollution that we have dealt with. And it's going to be the only way that we going to be one of the only ways that we change what's happening on the ground there. And so, I heard Cecilia talking about sort of the waste end. And so I'm really interested in looking at this on the front end, because my community is a manufacturing community, right? And we deal with all of the waste on that end, and how we can use sustainable chemistry at that particular point to help reduce the pollution in my community will essentially, work across the life cycle, work across, and it will reduce what kind of waste is generated. So again, this is more than just an academic exercise to me. It has real life implications. So just want to thank you guys for pulling this together.
Thank you, Maya. Another one of our committee members, Gabby Kazmarska from the Lego Group, is on the call, and I wanted Gabby to see if you had a few words that you wanted to comment on in terms of the process, or how you imagine how Lego will use this.
Yes, thank you, Sally, and hello, everyone. So for the Lego Group, I mean, the main reason for us to join this committee and to participate in this work was to make sure that we are on the right track if it comes to sustainable materials strategy. Because we kind of use our own definition of sustainable chemistry. So we really wanted to make sure that we wanted to clarify that we are basically doing the right things. And so this was the main reason why we joined, because I work with the chemistry criteria for the materials, and it has been an amazing experience, and I've learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward to actually applying this framework. We are not a chemical company, so but we will definitely push for, working with our suppliers, chemical material suppliers, to make sure that they use this framework when they develop new materials for us and improving our existing materials. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gabby. And then I also, Abigail Noble, who's with DTSC in California, or was until recently. Did you have any commentary that you wanted to make, Abigail?
I think a lot of folks have really echoed a lot of the reasons that that I was a part of the committee as well. So I think I'll leave some airtime for the discussion.
Okay,
Thanks.
Great. So we have some good questions here. And I think I'll start with Paul Ashford's question, because this is certainly something that we're all wrestling with. Paul's question was, using this definition, is it possible for a chemical to be sustainable in some applications but not for others? This always seems to be a challenge when trying to combine intrinsic chemical properties with their application. As you'll be aware, this sustainable chemistry by design is struggling with this at the moment. So this is the EU work on this topic. So does anybody want to take that on? And panelists, Joel, Amy, it's certainly something we talked about particularly as we were looking at the 5 criteria and really wanting for a product to be truly a product of sustainable chemistry to meet all of those criteria.
I'm sure Martin has an answer.
I don't know if it's a good answer though, but all along, not just in this forum, but in most every forum I've been engaged with, the sustainability of a substance is viewed from a life cycle perspective. And that means from the extraction of raw materials to manufacturing, to use, and to the end of use of that product. So yes, you have to consider how the chemical is applied. And you must have sustainability at each step along the product life cycle. And I emphasize the word cycle there. It's not a beginning to an end. And if any part of that cycle is not sustainable, then the entire cycle is not sustainable. So you need to work with materials that by their nature are renewable, low in toxicity, and in their application can be recovered, reused, and again, cause no harm. So it is possible, and you must consider the application as well as the material itself. That would be my answer.
Other, hi,
And
Paul.
just-
Turn on your
Okay.
video. Other comments? Saskia, was that you?
I was gonna say unintended use. So like toxic metabolites are obvious, but also when you transfer products across countries and across boundaries and people are using things for the first time, when we were dealing with one of our interns, and she lives in an informal settlement. And here we have steel wire scrubbers that you normally use for pots. But the psychological association is that steel wire scrubbers are the best to clean anything. So once we explained to her what microplastics were, she was saying, everybody in my community uses steel wire scrubbers to clean the plastic bowls and utensils. And I can't get them to understand this is causing a microplastic problem. I was like, yeah, because I can't see it. That's one example of unintended use. There's, it's not a deliberate fault of the manufacturer. It's just as things cross boundaries, people are creative. It's the beauty of human beings, but it's what we also have to try and anticipate.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because things are used differently in different cultural contexts too. Yeah, that's.
And I would add in that, as we said up front, is there's very few chemistries today that will meet the definition of that we've set out of sustainable chemistry. We know that. And so this is really a journey. We were very clear from the beginning that we had to sort of have an idea of where we wanted to go and say, how do we get there? And this is what we're striving to. So even if these criteria get thinking to happen, so one unique set of criteria is thinking about environmental justice and thinking about, well, where does that chemistry come from? Is, for example, a renewable version of a carcinogen, does that fit that definition? That's a tough one, right? But because it goes back, right? There would be definitely a difference of opinions on that question. So I think there's definitely room to grow, and this whole sort of sets a direction of what we need to be thinking about. Did you want to respond, Paul?
I'm just listening to this conversation. It's very helpful, actually, and but really what we're talking about here is sustainable use of chemicals. Because I think in listening to Martin's explanation of that, that's where you go. That makes it a lot harder to make this actionable, because you've then got to say, okay, who is defining what a sustainable use is and what are the criteria for the use? Now you've touched on all the points, but I think still the struggle is that that actually different people, especially on some of those touch points and criteria, will have different views and different weightings to various aspects of it. So I'm just slightly nervous. I love the definition. I have to congratulate you on that because it's really tough. But we probably need almost an interpretive document there to actually, or guidance to work out how to action it, which I just wanted to make the point. But I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, and I think, there's some of this is values driven, and that will be challenging going forward. And all, I think part of the reason for the 5 criteria and the emphasis on meeting all is that we know this progress will be incremental, but we don't want, you can't stop, you can't, often with incremental progress, it gets stalled. And we really wanted to encourage full, consideration of all of these aspects of sustainable chemistry. So we have time, I think, for one last question. I'm not sure this is a quick one, but I thought it was a good one. Heidi Siegelbaum asks, how do these approaches work with boards and C-suite managers in publicly traded companies? Now, this is going to be really challenging, but I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on how you could use this in kind of in a more of an investment context. How would you sell this? How would you sell sustainable chemistry?
So I'll jump in if I may, Sally. Seventh generation has consistently shown strong growth in all the years that it has promoted sustainable design of products and renewability of the raw materials that we use. I think it serves as just one example. We're a member of the American Sustainable Business Network, which represents 250,000 companies, all of which believe it is possible to have strong growth as well as more sustainable chemistries involved in your product design and use. So I think companies that recognize the need for greater sustainability have demonstrated it's possible to have viable, in fact, thriving companies. Companies as large as Unilever have made this the focus of their growth strategy, and successfully so. So I think it's both possible, and companies that ignore that reality are going to become the dinosaurs of the industrial age and lose their viability as they fail to progress.
Thank you for that, Martin. I'm going to let Cecilia make a last quick comment, and then I want to turn it back to Joel and Amy for next steps. So Cecilia?
So boards are going through globally, even in developing or emerging in industrial, what's called environmental social governance metrics, ESG metrics. The finance sector is really bringing those down. And also the other process they've gone through is emissions training, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So they understand carbon dioxide emissions. What we're now starting to talk about is lead, mercury, all of those have emissions too. So we're sneaking it that way into the emissions from the toxic chemicals. And then once they start understanding this in terms of air pollution, we can start talking about other venues of how you get sick, inhalation or ingestion or things like that. And like you said, it's a slow journey. It's not an easy journey. And I don't think the challenge is in understanding. I think the resistance and of natural resistance is the analysis CEOs start to doing about liability. How do I take on the responsibility for this when I don't know how much is in control of my supply chain, how much I'm liable for, or where I'm going to get the money to do the mitigation. So being sensitive to those considerations, I think, helps.
Thank you for that, Cecilia. So let me turn it back to Joel and Amy.
Yeah.
Next steps and close us out.
Thank you so much, Sally. And I'll just add in to finalize that question that we've been working, my colleague Alexandra McPherson from the Investor Environmental Health Network of Clean Production Action is here on this call. We've been doing a project with IEHN to engage the investment community around sustainable chemistry, around growing it. Also on the call today is ChemSec, which has been doing a lot of work with investors around chemical risk and ranking chemical companies on their chemical risk and their investments in green and sustainable chemistry. So there is a need to engage this at the highest levels of companies, and certainly we're doing this as well through the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council in our work. We're going to start bringing in some of these criteria, particularly around environmental justice and climate and circularity, into the discussions at the GC3. So thank you, Sally, and to our panelists for your contributions to the committee and to all of our work. As we said, we have a set of next steps here. We want to take this definition criteria broadly. We've asked you in the chat, give us ideas. We want your feedback. We want to think about how to grow this. We certainly have some next steps around presentations, blogs, and an open access journal article. We want to do some translational work for different audiences and leverage existing efforts, whether it be investors, companies, government, education. And then we want to sort of explore, what do these criteria mean in practice? How do you implement these in practice? And look at case studies, as Monica alluded to. Amy, what do you think? Where do you see it in the education community, next steps here, and the communities you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, as you guys can probably tell just from the discussions in the panel, consensus is hard, and trying to get, folks all on the same page. It's hard, but I think it's important, to agree upon the direction that we're going. I think in the education space, there's been so much, there's been so many leaders, actually. Some of them are here in the room today, the virtual room, that are bringing in, equity and justice into their teaching. They're bringing in, how do we address UN Sustainable Development Goals through chemistry, and they're bringing this into their teaching. And more and more of that needs to happen. I would say, from a green chemistry perspective, because I think there's always some sort of sensitivity around the differences of green chemistry and sustainable chemistry. Again, we're all moving towards the same goal, but it doesn't change the fundamental approaches that we take in green chemistry. If we're using that as a lens, hopefully it makes that bigger picture just much more, much easier to achieve all of these other pieces. So I'd say there's a lot I think there's a lot of potential to apply this throughout the education continuum as well. So I'm excited to explore that and develop it further. But yeah, I mean, what a great committee and leadership from both you, Joel, and Sally. I know you guys all said it. So thank you so much for all of your work on this and your commitment to it as well.
And we want to wrap up with a survey, a poll. We'll see if this works. Oh, there's the poll. So, let us know if you want to engage with us further. We want to take this work further, and it's important to us. So, we'll wrap up with that and say, thank you to all of you who have engaged in this process. Clearly, we had an amazing team, and Amy is a fantastic partner in this work. Our Sustainable Catalyst team, and Jonathan Moyer at Beyond Benign has been leading their teaching and learning community work, and he's a great future leader in the space of green chemistry. So that's the exciting thing about this work, is we engaged a lot of next generation leaders, and who we're going to need to take what we've learned here and take it to the next step. So with all of that, thank you for all of you for joining us today, to Monica for leading our discussion, and Sally and Amy and all of our panelists. And we will look forward to engaging with you further.